cities and towns are working to get this money accomplished, and unfortunately, we're right up against the winter holidays. So dealing with vacation schedules and everything else. I'll start with the bad news first. The bad news is there is not going to be a last minute extension of the obligation deadline. I think a lot of people were holding out hope that somehow the 12/31/24 obligation deadline would get extended, much like it did with the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund. The difference being that Treasury had administrative authority to make extensions with CARES. With the ARPA, State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, they do not have that administrative flexibility. The 12/31/24 obligation deadline and 12/31/26 expenditure deadline are actually written into the legislation. So it would take an act of Congress to move those dates. So it is what it is. We're dealing with the cards that are dealt with us, but I think we have strategies and flexibility and time left to make sure that all your funds are fully obligated. The good news is the 12/31/24 obligation deadline is a documentation deadline. It is not a reporting deadline. So I know there's a lot of confusion, emails being sent out by Treasury and others about updating your reports. What you need to have accomplished by 12/31/24 is documentation in your files showing that the obligations occurred. And that documentation could be fully executed contracts, subawards, beneficiary agreements, time and effort reports, estimation of grant administration and legal costs that you will need over the next 2 years, or interagency agreements directing how the money will be spent. So again, you don't have to have it reported. And in fact, if you're current with your reporting, you have no way of reporting it by 12/31/24. For quarterly reporters, the Treasury portal will not open up until January for you to put in a new report. And for annual reporters, it won't open up until April for you to update the report. So again, what you need to do by 12/31/24 is just make sure you have proper documentation in your files demonstrating that the obligations occurred. The other item I just want to touch on is the obligation deadline is only applicable to your allocation of ARPA funds. Many jurisdictions have now been sitting on their first and second tranche disbursements for several years. Hopefully you've earned a little bit of interest income. That interest income is not subject to the 12/31/24 obligation deadline, the 12/31 expenditure deadline, or any flow down requirements. It is not considered federal program income, and for all intents and purposes, it is general fund for you to make decisions about. So the only thing that needs to be obligated by 12/31/24 is your actual grant dollars that were dispersed to you by Treasury or passed through the state to you by Treasury. So with that, Jamie, I think we can open it up for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for that overview. And we'll dive right in. My questions. Here we go. Great. We're going to start with Lynn Luquette's question from Silex, Missouri. I need confirmatory information about obligating funds until they can be recorded in the portal. We cannot lose our money.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was just discussing, the 12/31/24 obligation deadline is a documentation deadline. So a really good thing is for you to either sort of self-monitor, do a review of your own documentation, or have a colleague take a look at it and make sure that you have, an executed contract. That could be a purchase order. It could be, something off cooperative purchasing, whatever your local procurement process is, but you have execute contract, execute subaward, beneficiary agreement, for past expenses, payroll records or whatever, showing that those occurred. And then if you have any remaining funds, you have two approaches really at this point, and that's either an interagency agreement that shows where the money will be directed after 12/31/24, or your documentation of your estimates of what grant admin, single audit, compliance, reporting resources you will need after 12/31/24. Uh, if you're using, if you're, I saw a question pop up about signed. If you're doing an interagency agreement that says, I'm going to give money to Habitat, that interagency agreement would be signed by the mayor and the housing director or whoever within city staff is going to do that. If you're not doing the interagency agreement and you're actually moving forward with a subaward with Habitat, that subaward would have to be fully executed by the 12/31/24. So whatever your version of obligation documentation is going to be, it needs to be fully executed, fully signed. It can't just be, a subaward has been issued but not fully executed. A contract has been issued but not fully executed. It's got to be an executed document.
And I think that your answer there might touch on a few of our other questions. Sharon Brower from Martinsburg, Pennsylvania. I know you asked a question sort of about how to deal with this mismatch, right, between when you can change your report and sort of reflect those obligations and the upcoming deadline. Sharon, was your question answered by what Matt said, or do you still have a question there? Give Sharon a second to come off mute. All right, Sharon, we'll come back to you if you want to, or if you just pop your hand up when you're ready. I know we have two Sharons on. I was talking about the Sharon Brower from Martinsburg, Pennsylvania. I know that also a similar question about this last piece that Matt touched upon about doing the interagency agreement and then later specifying the partner and getting the fully executed subaward. Noel from Waterloo, you seem to have a question on the same sort of topic. Was your question answered by what Matt said, or do you still want to sort of probe a little deeper?
Yeah, just to make sure I guess I understand. So yeah, if we do a either the mayor and myself sign it saying, hey, we're going to dedicate X amount of funds for housing rehabilitation, maybe acquisition of blighted structures. And we've been talking with a couple of agencies, including Habitat, about how to partner with them to do that. We don't have the agreement with Habitat. We probably don't have the exact structures we'd be buying or demolishing or something for, helping housing yet. But is that sufficient? Do we need to have council action to say that we're actually going to do this? Or is the mayor and myself sufficient to sign it and say that's what it's being allocated for?
Yeah, the MOU or the interagency agreement, as you described, is sufficient. And then, as you, refine the details and decide, which property or properties and whether you're going to work with Habitat or somebody else and enter into that subaward, down the road after 12/31/24, you would, go through your normal process. And I don't want to kind of highlight an unfortunate situation, but just to your south in Jackson County, Missouri, they're going through this process. They still have about 70 million to determine. And at this point, they're going to direct money to nonprofits and housing and everything, but there's no way any of those subawards or contracts are going to get across the finish line. So hopefully today, they'll get to a point where they can then do those interagency agreements, MOUs, fully obligate the money, and then into 25 they can then do those subawards and contracts. Just to reiterate, I think Sharon's question as well. When I talked about what the obligation standards are, which are these documents. What I failed to mention is when your single auditor, when Treasury, OIG, when the PRAC, when whomever comes out and looks to see if you fully obligated, what they're going to be looking for is that documentation. They're not going to be looking for your quarterly reporting or your annual reporting in Treasury. They're going to be looking for those, hard copy documents in your files. So that's why it's so important to have those and not focus on what was reported in the past, what would be reported in the future, but having those documents on hand.
Noel, did that fully answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Great. We'll go to the next question, which was from Manny Pangolin. Pangolin. Sorry. If we exceeded the threshold amount of our revenue loss, how do we report this?
So I guess I need a little bit more clarifying. If you're, you really can't exceed the threshold. You either took the standard allowance or you calculated it. If you need to go back in and update the revenue loss figure, certainly you can do that in future reports. When it comes to projects that you might have reported under 6.1 that exceeds that amount, you'll have to just go in and reclassify, those projects to other expenditure categories. And we have so much flexibility now with allowability that there really shouldn't be much trouble in reallocating it from a revenue loss project to another expenditure process. So, Manny, at this point, I'd really focus on just making sure you have the obligation deadline or obligation documentation, and the cleanup in the report can be done down the road.
Did that answer your question, Manny? Okay, great. Next question is from Bridget Wood, also of Waterloo. Can you use ARPA for new construction?
You can. It's how you go about doing it. Certainly under revenue loss, provision of government services, you can do it. Originally, when the state and local fiscal recovery funds were first made available, it had to be tied back to, a negative economic impact, or water, wastewater infrastructure, broadband infrastructure related to new construction. Since then, they've added additional flexibilities having to do with CDBG eligible projects and others. So new construction is fine. It's really, just the pathway for how you determined the project eligibility and where you report it from an expenditure category. I will say this, when it comes to federal funds, if it's within your budget, these are pretty strategic monies to use for capital projects because for the most part, the historic federal flow down requirements like the National Environmental Policy Act, Davis-Bacon, Buy American, et cetera, don't apply to these funds. So those federal provisions are usually an impediment to projects, either the timelines of projects or artificially increasing the cost of those projects. So ARPA is a good option for capital projects if that's where your community wants to head.
Great, Bridget, did that answer your question?
Yeah, the only reason why I asked it is because in the guidelines it specifically states that ARPA funds cannot be used for new construction. That's the only reason why I asked it, especially if it's in the category of Title IX or Title I funds. So you're saying if we classify it as our lost revenue, which is where we're working from, we can use it towards new construction, even if it is a Title I CDBG eligible project.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, so then it doesn't have to meet those ARPA requirements. It's just the lost revenue.
Correct.
Okay. I guess I misunderstood that before. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the compliance guidance are definitely a menu of what applies to what. But once you make a decision to go under the revenue loss category, there's a very specific subset of activities that are requirements that apply to the revenue loss projects.
Great. Our next question was from Collinwood, Tennessee, from Gary Victory. He asked if I'm purchasing a jetback trailer for our sewer department and the bid was open last Friday. My commission approved the bid, but the state hasn't approved it yet. Will my commission approving the bid in a meeting Monday, December 16th be sufficient paperwork to satisfy the obligation?
If the contract's not fully obligated, no. Or fully executed, no. So if you need the state approval before you can fully execute the contract, then I would go ahead and put together an interagency agreement that just says the intended purpose of the funding is for the jetback trailer. That's something you can do at the 11th hour if you still think, you might get that approval and fully execute it, but as we get closer to the obligation deadline, I'd be having that in my back pocket as a plan B.
Gary, do you have any follow-up? Okay. Hearing none, we'll go move on, but if you had any follow-up, just let us know. Caitlin Fitzgerald, I saw you were on. I think we answered the question you originally submitted by email, so I want to see if you have a different question or if you want any clarification.
No, thank you so much.
Of course. And then Delane Vogel from Hoka, Minnesota, you had said you have a question about fund use. Could you tell us a little bit more about your question?
Well, I was at the town board meeting this week and explained to them what the deadline was. And we have a pocket of money that we received. And the question is, can that money be used for road repair? Just because we're in a rural area, in a township situation, and we were just hoping that we could use some of that funding for some of our disrepaired rural roads.
Yeah, so I'm making the assumption that you're a non-entitlement unit of local government. You likely received an award amount well under $10 million. So you can use your entire grant award up to $10 million for revenue loss provision of government services. And within that category, anything that your city, town, township would normally do as a provision of being a government entity, you could do with the ARPA funds. So road repair, road maintenance is absolutely something that is an eligible activity for you to do. I would just, at this point, unless you have an existing, contract for a vendor, make sure you just memorialize through an MOU or an interagency agreement that that's how your community is going to use the money. But hundreds, if not thousands, of communities across the country are using ARPA revenue loss provision of government services money for culvert repairs, culvert replacement, gravel road, maintenance, road maintenance projects of all sorts.
Okay, that sounds really good. I think we do have a contract signed to complete this work, but we were just wondering if the funds could be actually used for that work.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think those are all of the pre-submitted questions we received, so we'll open it up if people have other questions they wanted to ask. You can just raise your hand or come off mute if you have a question. Caitlin, did you have a question?
Yes, I had a question. You say when auditing hard copies, do you mean we run with like a network and we are linked to like the cloud where we save all of our documents? Or do we need to have like actual hard files saved?
Sorry, I'm showing my age. No, you just need that.
Okay.
And if if it's in a SharePoint or Teams or however you would be able to provide those documents to the auditors.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Gary, I saw your clarification in the chat about the state, and I just wanted to see, it seemed like you maybe still have a question there. I think what Matt had recommended was doing a interagency agreement with respect to the purchase of the jet back. Is that right?
Yeah, and if you're just waiting on the state to determine whether would be allowable as match or not, that's one thing. If you have if you're able to go ahead and fully execute the contract with the vendor for the purchase, go ahead and do that. But if somehow the state approval is holding up the execution of that contract, then go ahead and do an interagency agreement just so you have documentation for obligation purposes.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, this is Delane from HOCA again. Will we be getting an email with a link as far as getting this obligation report done? I know we're not submitting it, but is there a link to do the process of obligation or just have the documentation at hand?
Just have the documentation in hand. You will not be, uploading it to a treasury portal or anything. Like you have to do with some other federal grants. Treasury is putting the onus on you as the grantee to meet that deadline. And then as far as the next reporting cycles, Treasury usually sends out a reminder, or you can always go to their state and local fiscal recovery page where they have the links as well as the most current compliance and reporting guide. But yeah, you won't have to certify that your obligation is complete. You won't have to
Good.
proactively submit copies to somebody, but make sure you have them in your files for down the road when monitoring activities might happen.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
What we're planning with our remaining funds is to do, among other things, a memorial park in our parkway. One of those things is to build a stage in memory of one of our mayors who passed. But there's a lot of little projects included in this. We want to hang a garage door. It has nothing to do with the memorial park. Can I document that and obligate that with a series of purchase orders?
Sure, absolutely. If you're at a position now to have those POs issued before 12/31/24, if some of those details are still coming together, then you might want to do the IA MOU, but POs are definitely an appropriate form of documentation for obligation purposes.
Okay, and do I need to get my board, need to have it documented in the minutes that the board is approving of all of this for further documentation, or is that necessary?
It's really up to your own local community standards. If they've already, put together a spending plan that you're just carrying out, if city staff have procurement authority up to certain thresholds, it really varies community by community. But the interagency agreement in and of itself does not have to be, ratified by your council or signed off by council.
Okay, all right. I just am very nervous about not doing the proper thing and losing this money. That's very nerve-wracking for me. So I appreciate all of this effort that you all are doing here.
Yeah, and hopefully this gives you a little bit of reassurance. When Treasury or the PRAC or anybody comes in and does a monitoring visit, does an audit, and they find out that, oh, you didn't obligate it correctly, or this isn't a suitable form of obligation. The first thing they do is they let you, go back and find, alternative documentation to justify the expense, justify the obligation. The next part of the corrective action would let you find other eligible expenses. So it might be, an expense the city or town had that really was never intended to be, ARPA, but the obligation happened before 12/31/24. It meets all the requirements. Really, the last straw, is to pay money back to Treasury and the federal government. So, review your documentation, do your due diligence. If you're really, want a insurance plan, do that blanket interagency agreement. But it's not just a, yes or no, return the money to us kind of conversation that will happen.
That's good news. Thank you.
And I don't think, Lynn, I don't think you're alone in being nervous about having these funds be taken away. So that's why we're doing this, because we don't want to see that happen to you either. Manny, I saw your question in the chat. We already use our revenue loss threshold. Can we still use the ARPA funds to purchase heavy equipment and for other operation needs?
Yes, no, and maybe. The first thing I would encourage you to do is to look at those projects you reported under revenue loss to see if any of those projects might, cleanly fit underneath some of the other expenditure categories, public health related projects, small business, negative economic impact, those sort of things, and just swap projects out from underneath revenue loss to build capacity. If that's not the case, there are some pathways for purchasing heavy equipment and other operational needs outside of revenue loss, usually related to first responders, public safety, neighborhood blight, small business support, even provision of recreation, travel, and tourism. So there are some options. I can't really give you a blanket yes or no without knowing a little bit more about your circumstances. But step one is really review the projects that you've classified to revenue loss and see if any of those can be reported elsewhere, and then go from there.
Great, thank you. We had a question from Sharon in the chat. When we go back into the next report, will we just be listing what we use the money for, or will we be uploading any documentation?
Unless Treasury makes some significant changes to their reporting portal, which we do not anticipate, you'll just be reporting on the projects, the obligations and expenditures to date. You won't be uploading any documentation. Some of the expenditure categories outside of revenue loss have some additional questions, some demographic questions. But again, you're just filling in numbers and data. You're not uploading copies of POs or invoices or any of that type of information.
Great. Gary Victory just asked, I purchased 2 police vehicles with our funds. Can we report these under revenue loss?
If you have revenue loss capacity, absolutely. You could report them under revenue loss. There's also a couple of the traditional expenditure categories you could tie those purchases to it as well. But if you have revenue loss capacity, I would encourage you to report them there. It's probably the cleanest place for them to be reported under.
Great. Anyone else have questions? Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. If a question comes to mind after you leave the session, please do reach out to us. We can find time to address that. We want to support you as much as we can between now and the obligation deadline. I want to thank Matt Hansen. I want to thank Amin Muhib from Bennett Midland for putting together today's session, and just want to thank you all who are working in cities, making sure that this money goes to delivering results for residents. So with that, we'll conclude today's session. Thank you.
Hi,
Oh,
Jamie.
Caitlin.
Yeah, sorry. I had, my boss had another question.
Okay.
So we're doing also personnel expenses and we're worried that maybe we lowballed the personnel. Would we be able to add more positions? Is that possible?
Are these positions related to grant administration or positions in elsewhere in city government?
Grant administration.
So I would, whether you've reported that through the estimation process or the IA process, I would just go ahead and pad those numbers now.
Okay,
And then report the increased, if you did it through the estimation approach, report that increase under 7.1 in the next reporting cycle.
you said 7.1.
That's the administrative category, correct?
Okay.
It's probably a good clarifying note, with an interagency agreement, quite honestly, with any of these agreements, you can put in up to amounts. That does not commit you to actually, following through. Most municipalities have some sort of clause in their agreements that talks about subject to the availability of funds. Certainly that would apply here. So, you think you might need $150,000 for personnel cost over the next 2 years. If you put, up to 300,000 or whatever, no harm, no foul. And that gives you a safe harbor to move money around post 12/31/24.
Okay, so if we typically have done the revenue loss, can we not report this under the revenue loss?
You can,
Okay.
if it's clearly administrative expenses, really no reason not to report it under
Okay.
7.1.
When you said 7.1, that made me a little nervous because we reported as.
Yeah, I mean, 7.1 is specifically for grant-related admin expenses, but
Okay,
either one is fine.
okay. And as long as, they were here before 12/31/24, like the obligation deadline.
Right,
Okay. And we could report that in January.
in your next reporting cycle. Yeah.
Okay. If we don't report it in January, can we do it at a later time?
You can report it whenever.
Okay,
I would just make sure that your next report, whether it be in January or April, show
Yeah.
that you fully obligated the money. Otherwise, you're going to get a series of nasty grams from Treasury.
okay,
But the important thing is to have the documented obligation in your files.
okay,
So
Right.
one of the jurisdictions I work with, we've over obligated probably by 30% on various projects.
okay,
And then in the report, we show that we're fully obligated, but we have these outstanding, placeholders where we can, move money around after 12/31/24 if needed.
okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Any additional questions? Let's see, Caitlin, Caitlin's a different question.
Yeah, and that estimation, and the documentation of how you, developed your estimate, that document alone can serve as an obligation.
Great. If there's no other questions, then we'll conclude today's session. And thank you all so much. And I'm gonna put the form in if you have additional questions that come up. Again, between now and the obligation deadline or after the obligation deadline, please feel free to fill that out and let us know.
This
Thank you all.
recording,
Oh, yeah.
this recording will be available in the portal.
It will be on our program website. I put that up, links that in the chat. Second.
I just added link.
Great.
So.
Yeah, it'll be on our program website.
Okay,
Thank you all. Take care.
thank you.